Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just going to quickly share screen if that's okay with everybody, so we can move ahead. Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about systems analysis. We at IIASA, of course, have been growing and developing our expertise in the area of systems analysis for many years. But for us, the key component of our work is not just the systems analysis, but the application to real-world problems and issues. And when we think about where do we stand as a humanity at this stage of the game, this is just a summary of some of the chief issues and big problems that face us. 71% of adults around the world own less than $10,000 in wealth at the moment. From a health perspective, life expectancy has doubled in a century, which is good, but we've had increasing inequalities in terms of life expectancy. 1 billion people around the world are considered obese, while less go hungry. About 100 million people in 2018 suffered from acute hunger across the world. And many of these inequalities that have been mentioned now so far have been amplified by the COVID pandemic, and the health consequences are still playing out around the world as we speak. From an environmental perspective, 9 out of 10 people breathe air with higher levels of pollutants. 1 in 9 people use water that are unsafe. 2.3 billion people lack access to a toilet. From a happiness perspective, more people die by suicide than by war or violence around the globe. And happiness inequality is on the rise. Everybody in the world has a mobile phone, at least numerically, but 1 billion people have no access to electricity. 3 billion people suffer from land degradation, desertification, and have missed out on the great acceleration over the last number of decades. So this is where we stand as a humanity across the globe and some of the challenges we face. We know that we will live in a complex world, and many of these issues are not easy to solve. I think collectively there was a huge step taken forward when Agenda 2030 was agreed to by the United Nations that set a target for us in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals that we want to deliver on collectively. I think it's a giant step forward and a collective agenda for the whole of humankind to pursue collectively. But that has to be done and dealt with in the context and against the backdrop of this complexity that we face in terms of dealing with these matters. So from a IIASA perspective, we feel that systems analysis offers a really sound and high impact route for dealing with some of these complexity problems that we face around the world. And when we think about systems analysis, there are 5 critical components as by the paper from Dickman and colleagues that you see listed at the bottom end, of systems analysis that are pertinent to dealing with these complex problems. The first of those is externalities. And externalities are created when we draw system boundaries too narrowly. And from an economic perspective, when we draw it so narrowly that we leave out the environmental and the social components out of the analysis, then we artificially create externalities. It's important that we draw system boundaries widely enough so that we can get a holistic accounting of the impacts that are likely to be precipitated of particular policy decisions. There's an opportunity cost associated where potential assets are sometimes viewed as costs, such as education and waste products, for argument's sake, in the context of industries, which could be utilized to deliver alternative solutions if they were inside the system boundaries. The second important component of systems thinking is feedbacks, feedback loops, positive and negative. We know that there's a feedback loop between population, education, and wealth. In the long run, that determines the demography of a particular population, and I'll get back to that in a minute again with a little bit more discussion around that issue. Third critical component is trade-offs and synergies that are frequently not well reflected in analyses that are silo and narrowly defined. Critical components are left outside the system boundaries when we think about the analysis, and that as a consequence, the trade-offs and the synergies are poorly quantified. As an example, when we think about we forget about the biodiversity consequences of an extensive biofuel production process, we forget that there are trade-offs as far as land use and biodiversity conservation are concerned. The fourth critical component is emergent phenomena. And this is particularly important in a species such as us, a human, a highly sociable species, where there are new, novel emergences that frequently catch us by surprise. We get new social movements that emerge, such as the Youth for Climate initiatives that happened quite recently. We get confronted with system tipping points that we find surprising, like lake eutrophication that happens at a particular level of pollution. And these tipping points or emergent phenomena are a critical component of systems thinking. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised by them. We should anticipate them and expect them when we're thinking about systems. The fifth critical component is the idea of stakeholders and how we deal with stakeholders as far as systems thinking is concerned. Important is the inclusive framing of solutions. If the community and society is part of the framing of the problem, the carrying out of the research and finding a solution, the idea of policy acceptance is heightened and increased. And this lies at the heart of the transdisciplinarity approach that's frequently been talked about. And we at IIASA also use very fruitfully a number of gaming approaches to make sure that we are as inclusive as we can possibly be in terms of coming to these solutions. I'm now going to just give you a few examples of those kinds of critical aspects of systems thinking and how IIASA work has impacted on this space. This slide summarizes the global cost of dealing with particular problems. Energy security on the left-hand side will cost you less than 0.2% of the global GDP to deal with that by itself. Air pollution itself, just under 0.6% of the global GDP, and climate change by itself, just more than 0.8% of the global GDP. So you add all of these on top of each other, you'll see that you can provide a much more cost-effective solution if you had an integrated solution for all three of these problems. And you can save about 40% of the total cost by thinking in terms of a holistic system rather than the individual components at the end of the day. So holistic accounting is really important of impact because it means it results in significant savings, a bit more efficiency. The population issue, the relationship between population and education and wealth, and that cycle. We understand that there's a virtuous cycle that's possible in that space. But starting a conversation about population control is unlikely to find significant support from the community. If your solution is to provide a basic income grant to everybody and give everybody wealth, the economists are likely to balk at that. But if you start the conversation at education, you will find much more fertile ground, and the chances are you can kickstart that virtuous cycle much more efficiently and effectively by looking at education as a driver rather than the artificial wealth creation, or alternatively driving to drive down population fertility rates. The key issue here is that there is a relationship between education and development, and the trajectories that you choose as a country or as a region are going to be determined by the levels of education. And it's a much easier way to start the virtuous cycle conversation. In terms of synergies, this is just a reminder that when we think about energy, we tend to think about the ways that energy is supplied and whether we can change from coal-based technologies or gas-based technologies to renewable energies, and how long is it going to take us and what is feasible and doable. But on the other hand, I think this study just illustrates very clearly that it's as important to look at the demand side of energy. By reducing the demand, we can make a significant difference in terms of the speed and the rapidity with which we can achieve the 1.5 degree target that we set ourselves in the Paris Agreement. So making sure that we exploit the synergies between supply side management of energy and demand side management, we can come to a much better and much quicker solution in that space. As far as trade-offs are concerned, this just illustrates to you that the more ambitious we are in terms of dealing with some of the perceived planetary boundaries that we face as humanity, there will be consequences for the way that we manage other sectors as well. This just illustrates that the more ambitious we deal with planetary boundaries, there's going to be a concomitant impact in terms of food price. So food prices will increase the more severely you manage the environment at the same time. So there is a relationship between the two, and we have to be cognizant of these trade-offs and anticipate them and deal with them in our thinking. The issue of emergence, and I'm using the COVID tragedy that we're dealing with at the moment as an example here. But COVID has demonstrated a few things to us, that societies can respond in surprising ways and surprising veracity and surprising speeds if they have to, if the occasion demands it. COVID certainly demanded that from society, and they did respond. And as a consequence of that experience, when we think about the sustainability pathways and what we can be done into the future, what has emerged are new recovery options that are now available to us in terms of actually achieving some of those objectives much more quickly and much more forcefully than we would have done possibly in a sort of a incremental way in the past in terms of changing the energy landscape or the climate landscape. New opportunities, new understandings of society and the way it responds to crisis has created new gateways for us to achieve the SDGs possibly even quicker than we thought. And we have to harness this new consciousness in society to achieve this. Stakeholders, very important. As far as the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals is concerned, IIASA has been working with the SDSN network and a project called FABLE, which is a bottom-up measurement process of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals from nation states, and we're collating that information, and that gets fed back into the UN processes for us to assess progress in terms of dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals. We know we're struggling to achieve those goals, but at least we have a clear idea as to what's happening in what spaces of the world, and we can understand what the next steps are in order for us to fast-track the achievement of those goals. At IIASA, there are a couple of tools that are relevant for our systems analysis approaches that we apply. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you'll recognize some of them. And it's this combination of tools that you'll encounter when you come and walk through the corridors of IIASA and talk to our researchers around the table. This is really what we offer as an institution, and for anybody that has an interest in some of these areas, please feel free to engage with the Institute. The idea of systems analysis, of course, is a multi-scale issue. It can be dealt with at smaller scales, intermediate scales, but we also have to tackle global problems. And this is a good example of a global assessment where we looked at water management interventions. One of the interesting consequences of this particular piece of work was to illustrate that the more severe your water management interventions are at a broad scale, the consequences are that you're pushing water scarcity downstream, both in terms of the river systems itself, but also in terms of its impact on society. So one has to be very careful in thinking about top-down solutions that have secondary consequences at a finer or a lower scale than necessarily the solution that you may be trying to resolve. This is an example of another international consequences, the air quality work that was done over Delhi. And what came out of this was quite clearly that the air quality problem in Delhi is not just caused by Delhi itself. It is caused by the surrounding environment in the way that the farming community and agricultural community operates, and also even neighboring states in terms of their activities. So the solution to the Delhi air pollution problem is not in the hands of the Delhi government or even the Indian government for that matter. It requires collaboration at a much broader scale, in the regional scale, to resolve this particular problem. And without that collaboration, this problem is never going to be resolved. Another dimension of international systems analysis, this is about population issues that everybody is acutely aware of. Some of the work at IIASA has demonstrated through our population unit that since the 1960s to now, a constant factor has been the migration of people across the world. And about 0.65% of the global population is constantly on the move. It's not increased the percentage, it's not declined the percentage, it's stayed constant. But we also have to have a good understanding about what the real pull and push factors are that either push people to migrate or pull them to migrate into particular parts of the world. Of course, as the population of the world's population increases, there will be more migrants, but it'll still be approximately the 0.65% of the global population. But in order for us to manage this environment and these issues better, we need to have a better understanding of the push and pull factors. Systems analysis has been on the fringe for a lot of the work around the world, and I think what we're trying to do is to illustrate at many scales that it's relevant for coming up with useful and very practical solutions for very real problems. This is an analysis that was done in the Zambezi Valley, where they were looking at issues of water, land and energy, that nexus conversation again. And you can see some of the problems that are faced by the Zambezi community. Low agricultural productivity, high deforestation rates for charcoal production, and there's an energy deficit around the entire area as well. And you'll see at the bottom curve here, at the end of the curve here, that there was a business as usual analysis done. In other words, what we see is a steady deterioration of the entire environment in terms of water delivery, energy delivery, and of course land use or land deterioration as well. Through using some of our integrated models at IIASA, we could actually come up with 3 resilient pathways or resilient futures for that particular community. Different pathways with different emphases on different time frames, but the idea is that there was a choice of 3 pathways that could be considered collectively and chosen by the community in order to have a pathway that will allow them to have sustainable water supplies, to improve the land use and quality of land, but at the same time also increase the energy availability. So real practical solutions at multiple scales with integrated disciplinary contributions are possible and are starting to change people's lives. Again, about mainstreaming, IIASA has also been involved in informing national and international macroprudential policies. This was in response, of course, to the 2008 financial collapse, where IIASA worked to reduce systemic risk by restructuring the financial networks, and then came up with a solution of a systemic risk tax that had to be included in these networks to strengthen them and to make sure that the kind of collapses that happened in 2008 become less frequent and less harmful at the same time. We at IIASA focus a lot of time and energy on the methods that we use. This is a collection of the suite of models that we have available to look at various issues, from air pollution to energy to economics, populations, land use issues, water issues, etc. So the idea is that we put these models together in different combinations, and I think the strength of the work at IIASA is not only that we have these different models, but the fact that we can get them to engage and interact with each other. And that's really what we're trying to do in terms of growing and developing our capacity to deal with systems-based approaches to solving global problems. The particular example about methods has just come out recently. We're working with a private company called SAS, which you may know, to deliver using Earth observation data, a crowd-driven training of an artificial intelligence system to help us track deforestation in the Amazon forest. So the idea is here, and this is quite far advanced already, to have an AI that tracks these satellite images and analyzes them, and can hopefully come up with a system that is near real time in terms of detecting deforestation in particular areas and identifying hotspots where the agencies that are responsible for managing that particular environment can actually engage and deal with the problem as quickly and efficiently as possible. So this is an indication of new data sets that become available as a consequence of using the latest technologies for understanding key systems across the world. Lastly, to finish off with our systems, science for transformation to sustainability is concerned, this is our new strategy. We've put in place, it contains 7 interlinked research themes organized into 6 programs. The key areas of new work that is new to IIASA is focusing on just societies, new economic frontiers, biodiversity, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And we're launching a number of large-scale interdisciplinary research projects that we conduct together with our national member organizations on shared problems. That's a key feature of the new strategy. There's a focus on increased capacity development, and IIASA in this new strategy, as I mentioned in the earlier talk, will continue to be a facilitator for science diplomacy across the system as a whole. So thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, dear ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you are hearing me well. I'm grateful, first of all, for this opportunity to share with you my thoughts on today's session, focusing on the challenges of the Eurasian region faces and what role the systems analysis can have in addressing them. I want to start my speech by emphasizing that here in the Eurasian Economic Commission, we understand the value of the importance of systems analysis on such issues as economic cooperation, connectivity, and dialogue in Eurasia. The Eurasian region is so diverse and dynamically developing that expert community support and continuous presence in these discussions is very fundamental and necessary in order to keep track of the proceedings in this region. Research and expert meeting create the necessary conditions for the further development of dialogue and partnership. Currently, the Eurasian Economic Union is the 3rd largest trading partner of the European Union, which defines the need for continuing cooperation with these 2 regional integration associations. Perhaps each participant of this discussion today can recall several examples of fruitful interaction projects between the regions of Europe and Eurasia. There is also no need to dig deep to find grounds for mutual interest between the 2 respective regional integration associations. The Eurasian Union needs European investments and technologies, and among other things is willing not only to act as a geo-economic bridge between the EU and the leading economies of the Asia-Pacific economic cooperation, but also to offer its own solutions for economic development based on high technologies and scientific potential. At the same time, the European Union is interested in the stability of energy supplies from the EIU countries to ensure the energy security. All of this combined determines Europe's interest in a deepening cooperation with the Eurasian Economic Union. And we in the Eurasian Economic Commission looked with great optimism at the project challenges and opportunities of economic integration within a wider European and Eurasian space launched in 2014 by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. This initiative, which was supported by the Eurasian Economic Commission, the European Commission and the Eurasian Development Bank, has become the main analytical platform to unite experts from both commissions, Eurasian and European. In that period, the project provided opportunities for establishing a systemic dialogue between the two integration associations, and at the same time, the need for a deeper study and identification of issues within the framework of the greater Eurasian agenda was recognized. We hope that the continuation of this project would become a starting point for both political and advanced expert dialogue between our two integration associations, because in deepening of this cooperation is interested, first of all, the business of our countries. In every platform, there are lots of issues of cooperation are being discussed. We hear the voice of our business to deepen and to start this dialogue. The freezing of relations occurs contrary to the economic interests of two parties, as I mentioned. And now coming back to the significance of dialogue between two integration associations, EU and the EIU, we cannot ignore the fact that some progress is still underway. There is already an established dialogue in the format of technical consultations, which are continuing no matter what. The business circles, as I mentioned, despite the lack of political will, also maintain their contacts. Accordingly, now we see very different, sometimes even contradictory trends unfolding in Eurasia. The COVID-19 pandemic has, of course, changed the general perception of the nature of international economic relations and even caused doubts on the postulates that are customary for so many of us. As a result of this, a new perspective at the global issues such as migration, the economic security, the concepts of regionalism and integration has developed. In line with these fundamental global challenges, new issues are emerging that require our joint actions. Now, we in the Eurasian Economic Commission realize the interconnection between the global issues and strive to combine our efforts for the sake of contributing to their solutions. The pandemic didn't overshadow the importance of this dialogue. On the contrary, it identified that the weak links that we had, and now the significance of a systemic analysis and analytical approach to the challenges facing our partnerships becomes more and more apparent. I am sure and I believe that IIASA provides a unique platform for all of us, which allows the parties to unite and promote maybe mutually beneficial interests. In such situation, the project we are discussing, implemented by IIASA Institute and the Eurasian Development Bank in cooperation with the Eurasian Economic Commission, seems to be almost the only effective alternative, thanks to which representatives of the supranational bodies of the two unions can maintain contacts, at least at an informal level. Moreover, the nature of the project launched in 2014, which I mentioned earlier, is scientific, and science most often has the potential to work even where politics is powerless. The report conducted within this research initiative allowed IIASA to hold side events on the sidelines of the OSCE ministerial councils in 2017, 2018, and 2019. Therefore, it is very important that the IIASA Institute, touching upon the issues of economic cooperation between the countries of the Eurasian continent, continues and increases its relevance. Once again, I would like to thank for the invitation and for your attention. Maybe any questions, I will be glad to answer. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody, and also good morning to everyone dialing in from the Americas, and good evening to everyone coming in from Asia. This session is called Harnessing the Power of Systems Analysis, and in this session I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Ismael Serageldin, who is Emeritus Librarian of Alexandria. He was the founding director of the Biblioteca Alexandrina, the new Library of Alexandria, and a former Vice President of the World Bank. It therefore gives me great pleasure to give the floor to Ismael Serageldin for his speech about harnessing the power of systems analysis. Over to you, Dr. Serageldin.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this important gathering. And with your permission, I would like to present some slides. And there it is. There we are. Okay. Systems analysis is really the only way to go to deal with complex realities. And we all know that our realities are very complex. My outline, I'm going to run on something on the limits of reductionism, and then the costs and benefits of simplification or even oversimplification, and then a brief look at what we're dealing with, and then I will have 2 or 3 examples, and then come and end with the importance of proper policy. And policy can only be designed if we have undergirded it with proper analysis, and that cannot be done, I believe, without proper systems analysis. Now, on the limits of reduction, we use a reductionist approach to focus on a small part of a very complex reality. So on one level, we can say that human beings are 3 buckets of water and a handful of minerals, which may be useful in some analysis done in a pathological lab or something like that. But fundamentally, it is not equal to all the creativity, the reflection, the caring, the identity, the belonging that human beings bring. And in the same way, yes, I am a Vice President of the World Bank, and that's all the more reason why I will say that the living reality of a society cannot be reduced to its national income accounts. In fact, that has been analyzed by some of the greatest economists in the world who produced that report a few years ago for President Sarkozy of France, that GDP is not actually measuring our lives the way we should do it. And in economics generally, we have suffered from oversimplification. So economists looking for a simple gross answer to a simple problem, like if total population is growing at a net rate in a country, say by 2%, how many people will there be in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years? Well, that works reasonably well, but if you extend the time horizon, then you have issues like net in and out migration, you have pandemics, you have disasters occurring, cumulative effects, tipping points, etc., all come into play the longer time horizon. And the tool is no longer suitable. And economists used to think, well, the easy way of doing that is to assume that these other things are exogenous. So the notion of externalities. And I was one of the people who at the World Bank used to argue that we must internalize the externalities, because too many complex variables, they could not be easily incorporated into simplistic models. And for example, the environmental and social costs of bad investments were not included in the calculations leading to a decision to invest. And throughout the Industrial Revolution, we have had that. We have had pollution, air and water pollution as a result of that. And we have seen how plastic on the beaches, plastic on the oceans and in our food streams are really fundamental problems today, but simply because people thought that, well, if I throw that garbage out into the ocean or into the air or into the water, it doesn't count. It's a zero cost. Well, that's not true. And we now know all of these things and we have to incorporate them. We have lost beautiful corals near Australia, as you know, and elsewhere as well around the world. So what are we dealing with? Well, I think we are dealing with several things. First of all, human population is growing. And along with it, income and expenditures are growing, and our capacity to impact the environment is growing. And this is very important because it shows where the growth rate, the rate, drops dramatically, the total population continues to grow very slightly reduced until it reaches a peak. And that effect is that it is not immediate and it does not lead to a reduction of what is there until it goes negative. Incidentally, this is exactly the same problem that we have, not just human population, but we have in greenhouse gases for climate change and the greenhouse effect. The gases are up there, and unless we go into net negative, they will not reduce the emissions, no matter how small they come. If they come at zero, they will still leave for many, many years and decades the greenhouse effect functional. So generally, we have said that inextricably interlinked, we have energy and climate change, we have food and water, and we have poverty and equity. Each one of those circles is incredibly complex, but the fact is that all three interact together. So let's take quickly energy and climate change. We know all about the history of emissions and how we wanted emissions control, but what we have not really been fully willing to recognize, this is of course where the countries are in terms, this is the emissions, and here you can see oil, coal, and gas. And this teensy bit here is renewables. So the CO2 increases have broken past historical cycles and must be understood as our responsibility. In fact, if you see here, you will see these are the cyclical patterns that go back 400,000 years. But here is the part that we are now ourselves producing. And as you can see, it's much, much greater than anything else. This is the distribution of who's producing how much in these emissions in per capita terms and in the aggregate. And if we look at the past 25 to 30 years, this is very troublesome because 1992 was the first year of the UN Climate Convention, and all the major indicators by just before this COVID situation show that the demand for fossil carbon increased, did not decrease, increased. As a result, during those 25 years, the global consumption rose by over 50%, and CO2 emissions rose by more than that, actually 57%. And if you look at the fossil fuels in the global primary energy consumption, they remained unchanged between 85 and 90%. So we're not doing well despite our analysis. How bad are we doing? Well, you can see here, these are emissions, and this is a target temperature. And we've been going up, as I just said. So now if we are going to actually come down to zero net emissions by 2050, we have to have an absolute sudden drop like that. In fact, even go into negative emissions. And even then, we will probably overshoot the temperature. And then by the negative emissions, bring it down. And that will be very rapid decarbonization. Now, many people, including myself, do not believe that this is likely to happen. It is too abrupt, too extreme. And we really have difficulty to believe that this can be done, especially if we consider these drivers for continued energy consumption. What are these drivers? Well, number one is population growth, lifestyle and obesity. Despite Beyond Beef and the Impossible Burger and vegan people, global meat consumption is expected to double between now and 2050. Steel production, which uses carbon as well, and cement requirements are rising. And we're continuing to burn coal. And China is financing scores of coal-fired stations. And we expected 250% growth in container shipments in 50 years. And oil tankers are not going to disappear. And we will soon be returning to long distance flight travel. And there's no dramatic technological breakthrough. The best in terms of airplane design is still on the drawing boards. And even then, they may not have that big an impact on the carbon footprint of air travel. And if you look at emission intensity, the rate of a pollutant relative to the intensity of specific industrial production process, grams of carbon released per megajoule, etc. If you look at that, we will get emission intensity may be reduced, but we need to bring the total emissions to zero by 2050 or thereabouts. Or the new normal will include extreme weather events. Forest fires from California to Australia will be all year round, and all the other things that you know. I'm not going to go through the litany of these disasters that you know only too well. So far from being on a path towards 1.5 to 2 degrees, we are well on our way towards 3.7 to 5.2 degrees. And we need urgent action on both mitigation and adaptation. And we have to study our likely scenarios. So if you look at this, this is pretty much what I showed you earlier. And there you have traditional biomass, coal, crude oil, natural gas up to here. And then these are all the other renewables, this little piece here. So we're nowhere near where we need to be to talk about decarbonization. And that sheer drop that I showed you is very much what we must seek to do. It's extremely difficult to do. And we don't know exactly what would make it happen. If you look at this graph, this is the various analytical models that we have here. Incidentally, the 1.5 degree is completely off the chart. As you can see at the bottom here, 1.2 to 1.7. So we are way beyond that right now. This is, again, if you look at the top three, these are the fossil fuels. Together, in terms of their aggregate compared to that aggregate, is quite large. And this is the path that we are on. These were 2014 estimates. And we are now on this path, which is 3.2 to 5.4, roughly, let's say, 4 degrees plus or minus 1.2 to 1.4 degrees. So this is, again, where we're going to see the overshoot in that. And if you see what we can do in terms of advanced technologies, well, they'll bring us down from 42 gigatons to maybe 30 gigatons. And that minus 40 to minus 70, which we need to get, and even then we're not at zero, that will have to come from behavior, will have to come from different things. Technology, so far that we can see, will not be the savior that will save everything. Where is this hitting? After all, this is a conference on Eurasia. It's primarily Asia. Asia right now is the major actor on that, and India and China and others play a big role in that. And if we look at where all the different ways in which we can reduce from the likely path of emissions, the biggest impact comes from efficiency increases. We can be much more efficient in how we use energy. Well, some people say, why not go for geoengineering? And doing engineering schemes on a global scale that will combat climate change and reduce the energy, the greenhouse gases that are associated with the energy. Well, why shouldn't we do that? Well, some of us really remember the carbofluorocarbons and the ozone layer. If you remember that, who would have thought that a minor refrigerant could result in a hole in the ozone layer? And what is this here? Something has happened. And so we want to find a way of doing that without having the same risk, because who would have imagined that refrigerants and the propellants would result in a hole in the ozone layer? So what can we do? Well, in terms of geoengineering plans, there are some who look at how we can reflect to block the sun, either with space parasols or giant parasols, or other techniques like inducing rainfall and cloud seeding, or other techniques to seek to mitigate the risk with aerosols. But the problem with most of these is we don't fully know what they would produce. We think we know, it's extremely difficult, so we have to model them. But because there are so many interactions, everything interacts with everything else, and the risks include such things as dispersion, acid rain, impacts on crops, etc., we have a serious problem of trying to understand what we can and cannot expect out of that. And the analysis is very serious because it could be the equivalent, as the Harvard group said, we can do geoengineering that is equivalent to a volcanic eruption, which of course blocks the sun and reduces the heating that we get. Others are saying, let us get into thinking in terms of planting. Well, okay, that seems nice, planting trees. We're complaining about deforestation anyway. And in fact, in Ethiopia, they planted 350 million trees in 12 hours, which was a new record at the time. And they say, well, that's a new way of dealing with the geoengineering, and it's a good and benign way. Well, maybe, maybe not. 1 trillion trees? No, that is being, in fact, criticized by a number of scientists because it would impact the albedo effect of the Earth. What we mean by that is that the sunshine that comes to the Earth is reflected, and that is the measure. Albedo is the measure of how much light that hits the surface is being reflected without being absorbed. And forests are darker, and therefore they will absorb more. And white, of course, reflects the most. So others are saying, well, how about direct air capture? And here are examples of tests being done of small direct air capture, where the idea is we capture the CO2 from the air and then push it into the ground. And that, of course, has huge costs. Others think that the oceans should be activated even more. But the oceans are already one of the planet's major carbon sinks. And we don't know how much more they could absorb and under what circumstances and what side effects would happen. But what we do know about the oceans right now is that all the reports say that the ice is melting more, the oceans are rising faster, and the oceans may not be able to absorb as much CO2 as we hope. So that is quite serious. And what is even more serious is that you get a multiplier effect. So when the Arctic was covered by ice, it reflected 90% of the sun's rays, but the dark water will absorb 96% of the sun's rays. And some people fear geoengineering because of the continuation of bad habits while counting on a technological fix, whereas we need to actually change our habits, as was said before. And also something I call the toothpaste effect, which is that once you've done something, you may not be able to put the toothpaste back into the tube. And if we unleash aerosols in the stratosphere, getting them down is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible. So we need more research, more thinking, more systems analysis, because as you can see, everything links with everything else, and we need to will to act on already things that we know, because we need to be reminded of the potential of an ecosystem collapse. We don't know just what kind of a curve we have, and we know we are somewhere up here, but it could lead to a faster collapse where the cumulative stress on the environmental ecosystem results in that drop down. So as you can see, it's a very complex set of problems. We have a lot of data, a lot of analysis, a lot of work being done, but we need the proper systems analysis to be able to look at the whole system together. If you look at the agricultural commodities and the food supply system, there are models that are done for global, and but this particular one I will leave aside. That requires a whole discussion by itself. Let's look quickly at global water. We also have models, and the models include a very large part of the agricultural sector, because about 2/3 of global water withdrawals are going for production of food in agriculture. And then there's environmental drainage and runoff to the sea and so on. And 1995, I gave a warning to the world on water wars. And I said the wars of this century, 1995, have been for oil, but the wars of the next century will be for water. Why? Well, it was fairly easy to see rising water use. The population in the 20th century grew threefold. Water use in terms of withdrawals grew sixfold. And water, fresh water, is very scarce. About 97.5% of our global water is saline, it's in the seas. 2/3 of the fresh water is locked in glaciers and ice caps. And of the remaining part, 2/3 of that is lost to evapotranspiration in what we call the hydrological cycle. And that leaves a certain amount, about 40,000 cubic kilometers. Of that, 20% are too remote in wilderness and so on. And of the accessible part, 3/4 come as floods and are not readily usable. So you can see that it is very, very precious indeed. And here you can see the countries that have physical water scarcity and economic water scarcity, the red and yellow here, and the blue are those who have little or no. So actually, with UNESCO, with IIASA, we did water scenarios looking from 2013 to 2050, and we found that we had to change the way we think about water and agriculture, and we had to find ways of bending the curves, as we called it at the time, rather than these were the forecasts that were going on. And is it possible? Actually, yes. These are some of the reports that we produced, and the dynamics of water futures were subjected to these 10 drivers: agriculture, climate change, demography, economy, ethics, governance, infrastructure, politics, technology, and water resource management. And these are the interaction effects between all these drivers. And the objective was to find the scenario, the path, the necessary actions to reduce water stress, increase environmental sustainability while achieving optimum human well-being. And that's the kind of diagrams that we have in doing systems analysis: water stress and sustainability, well-being, etc. And all these effects have to be taken into consideration when we do forecasts. So we had 9 salient descriptors, which you see here, and the plot narratives outlined to each of the scenarios. And this wheel diagram looked something like that. This is the conventional word. We have 5 diagrams, which you can see here. And then with these 5 diagrams, we went from UNESCO to IIASA, which led the redesign of initiative using applied systems analysis for scenarios taking into account options for action. So you have concerns of economic efficiency, equity, environmental sustainability, and you find a balance for water for livelihood and water as the resource. Now, all of that shows that you really cannot analyze all of that without systems analysis. And that's why it is so essential that your meeting here address these kinds of things. My final point is about the importance of proper policy. By that, I mean, everything interacts with everything. So there's an absolute importance to systems analysis. What do I mean by systems analysis? It's integrated, interdisciplinary, international, independent, solution-oriented, long-term, looks at trade-offs. All of that constitutes a systems analysis rather than a simple linear regression or something of that nature. Why is that very important? Because that's how we design optimal policies. And as you design policies, as a person who has been very involved with that for many years, I say always ask who pays and who benefits, and always trace the shifting and incidence of taxation and subsidies. Now, this is a very important graph, was done by my friend Peter Glick, published in the National Academy of Sciences. This was the red is the growth of the US GDP, and these were the water withdrawals, the blue. And of course, people said, well, if you touch the water withdrawals, you're going to break down the economic growth of the United States. Well, the answer is not true. What happened here? What happened here was the Clean Water Act. The regulation of the withdrawals of the water from the various aquifers, etc., and the pollution of the water resulted in the US water withdrawals not only remaining flat, but even going down, while the GDP continued to grow. So these corporations who say, well, you know, you can't touch this and you can't touch that. No, we can, and we can do it well, and there is better ways of dealing with it. This is pretty much my last slide. We just been through the COVID, and different countries have followed different policies, but there are really 2 worlds. This is the East, and this is the West. And the factors in terms of fatalities is more than 100-fold, 100-fold, not twice, not 3 times, not 5 times, 100 times more fatalities in the West than in the East. Why? Well, there have been policies that have been put in place early, a more comprehensive set of policies, and more rigorously pursued. And so I say that we are in a world where we are all together, whether it is climate change or water or whatever, and whether it's for the environment or for the coming generation or for Mother Earth herself, we have to learn to use systems analysis in order to design the best policies for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Serageldin. That was a fantastic talk, illuminating, and thank you so much for showing the value of systems analysis in tackling some of the biggest challenges of our time: climate change, water scarcity, and even COVID itself. Thank you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to hear from you.